First of all, thank you, Lucy and Sharon, for asking us all to contribute to this session and for coordinating it so smoothly. At this session, we shall be looking at labeling and terminology as it applies to multiples and replication, and also to questions of surfaces and patternation. Using terms consistently has been addressed by our first three speakers collaboratively in their engagement with the casting project. These are Jane Basset, conservator at the J. Paul Getty Museum, Francesca Bewer of the Harvard Art Museums, and David Bourgarit, who's the project manager of the casting project at the Centre de Recherche et de Restauration in Paris. And David will be coming in on the discussion. Jane and Francesca will be initially exploring the complexity of terms used in bronze casting. And this will be followed by two speakers looking at the implications of what they say for sculpture replication and the making of sculpture in the 18th and then the 20th centuries. I'm Malcolm Baker, retired teacher with a long-standing interest in the history of sculpture, and I'll be focusing on the 18th century. And then Marin Sullivan, director of the Harry Bertoia Catalogue Raisonné project, will address issues involved in cataloguing sculpture and very distinctive sculpture of the 20th century. So first, the joint presentation by Francesca and Jane.
Thank you, Malcolm, and greetings to you all. And our thanks to the team members of the International Catalogue Raisonné Association and to Sharon Hecker for inviting us to participate in this event. We are thrilled to be joining you in such good company on this panel. As Malcolm said, I'm Francesca Bewer, and I'm research curator for conservation and technical studies programs at the Harvard Art Museums. Jane Basset is the senior objects conservator at the J. Paul Getty Museum, and David Bourgarit is the scientist in charge of metallurgical studies at the Center for Research and Restoration of the French Museums in Paris, and he will jump in later for the panel discussion. We'll be talking about the project that we've been involved in for many years. And you can see on the title slide what casting stands for. The three of us first collaborated on extensive technical research in preparation for a big international exhibition of French bronzes that took place in 2008 and 2009. In the course of our many exchanges, we came to recognize the acute need for more opportunities for interdisciplinary communication and for some guidance for those undertaking research and communication in the technical study of bronze sculpture, especially in view of sharing reliable and comparable data in bigger collaborative projects. That was the genesis of what came to be known as the casting project. A better understanding of bronze casting processes can be of value in many contexts, and you can see these pointed, sort of outlined here on the slide. Among other things, it is key to correctly identifying, attributing, and labeling a bronze as one would for a collection or sales catalog, or as in your case, a catalogue raisonné. Bronzes and casts generally are a particularly challenging category of sculpture, not only because the process is inherently reproductive, but also because these works are the result of collaborations. Most often, they are the fruit of a sequence of specialized processes executed by a number of different experts: the sculptor, who may hand the model to a mold maker, and then various people will deal with it in the foundry. Then there's the chaser who will finish the metal cast, and then finally a patineur may give it the finishing touches. So a more nuanced grasp of artistic processes and a trained eye can allow us to tease out distinctive patterns in the facture of a sculpture that might be characteristic of one or another of the people involved. And determining who was involved in the production, and thus also when a work may have been made, is, I believe, part of the correct labeling process that many of us are involved in. Successful technical research, much like bronze casting, relies on collaboration, in this case, on interdisciplinary collaboration. It usually involves experts engaged in more traditional historical research, such as art historians, who work together with scientists specialized in heritage materials and conservators who have experience with close looking at objects. It may involve others as well, like artists and founders. For the casting project, we pulled together many colleagues from different fields, and you can see on the left side of the slide a sort of list of the different kinds of expertise that we drew on in order to capture as broad a range of perspectives and knowledge as possible. We counted over 60 members from more than 25 institutions worldwide. And together we identified the questions that are of interest to the various categories of experts and hashed out the format and content of a publication titled Guidelines for the Technical Study of Cast Bronze Sculpture. A smaller core team ultimately wrote the manual, which will be released in digital and print-on-demand forms by Getty Publications in February 2023, and the digital one will be free access to all. These guidelines were conceived as a resource for anyone entrusted with the study and publication of sculptural works in bronze. Our goal has been to help people better understand the intricacies of bronze sculpture by laying out the various methods of production and how to investigate and interpret the remaining physical evidence of these methods on the artworks. And we hope that it will also facilitate more and easier conversations and collaborations across areas of expertise and disciplines. In the time remaining, we will give you a brief overview of the guidelines and then focus on a few examples of the challenges we had around select technical terms. To the structure. A general introduction provides context for such research. It dedicates a lot of time also to describing variations of bronze making processes, as we found that even among sculpture experts who have studied bronzes for years, there can be confusion not only around the complex sequencing that involves models and molds, sort of the negative, positive sequencing, but also with the specialized terminology. In volume 1, we have attempted to provide guidance on how to recognize the evidence that each of the process steps might leave on the bronze sculpture. The chapters are organized in more or less chronological sequence. You can see that here, starting from the creation of the model and through the mold making and all the way through to the patination, coating. They're designed around questions. And we also included sections titled Risks of Misidentification throughout. These latter serve as a reminder to readers that expertise cannot be acquired solely from reading a manual. So we're not sort of aiming for this to be the golden key to answering all questions. And that input from a range of disciplines is key to integrating the findings in a meaningful way. Volume 2 offers an overview of the techniques and instruments used in the scientific examination and analysis of bronze casts. Despite the volume's more scientific nature, it too is conceived for a range of readers, including collectors and curators, who might be interested in questions that range from how do I best measure a bronze, and why does one need to take a sample and of what size, and to what are the advantages and disadvantages of a particular analytical technique over another, or how do I go about planning a technical study? It's the bigger picture. And throughout, our attempt has been to be user-friendly. To complement these 2 volumes, we present 7 case studies that focus on works from different periods and cultures, and that also model a range of technical studies with different scopes. These all draw on the research of casting members.
The publication includes well over 500 images from the members' research projects, including lots of details and radiographs, many of which are annotated with an interactive layer with pop-up captions that can be toggled on and off to guide the reader. The need to create a shared vocabulary seemed key to the project from the start. The lack of an agreed upon technical terminology was driven home again and again as we worked on it. Several issues became apparent. Either a single term had multiple definitions, as in the case of patina, or numerous terms refer to a single concept, as with intermodel, and we'll return to both of these terms shortly. We also identified processes or concepts that were so unique to a specific author that they had no translation in other languages, as with casting plan. For the online publication, a selection of 60 terms was made out of over 200 that were gathered into a database hosted by the C2RMF. This selection was chosen based on the frequency of use in the study of bronze sculpture and the level of ambiguity. Each term will be added to the Getty's Art and Architecture Thesaurus. A link to this invaluable resource is given here. Full definitions are presented in both English and French, and we also offer translations in German, Italian, and Chinese. The terms are linked to images in the visual atlas, and each term and its translations have at least 2 authoritative bibliographic sources. These include dictionaries, historical sources, craft and trade publications, and specialized academic publications. The rich terminology associated with sculpture, and in particular with bronzes and foundry work, is very specialized. It can also vary to a surprising extent between different groups of specialists, such as professional foundry practitioner and historians of bronze sculpture, or even between experts from different chronological or geographical areas within a field. The casting guidelines aim to clarify some of these ambiguities. Patina is a good example. Its meaning varies greatly from one professional sphere to another, and there was considerable disagreement within our group over how to define the term. Towards the goal of fostering communication between disciplines, it seemed essential to include all commonly held definitions. 1, a general description of surface alterations acquired over time that can be found on all works of art and cultural artifacts that may add aesthetic value to it. This definition falls in line with traditional art history. 2, to those with a materials science viewpoint, the term may refer specifically and solely to the transformation of the metal surface to a mineral layer through processes such as burial, atmospheric corrosion due to pollution, or intentional transformation through the application of chemicals and heat, in other words, chemical patination. And finally, 3, to many in conservation and museum circles, patina also refers to added organic layers, including varnishes, pigmented waxes, or paint, such as the oil and resin varnish mixtures used extensively throughout Europe in the 16th through 18th centuries. We then proposed that the term coating may be used to specify applied organic patinas such as these. And in the end, we all did agree that a patina is an inherently unstable, complex system that will evolve over time. It's understandable that without practical knowledge of these processes or scientific means of analysis, most people who deal with bronzes find that correctly identifying the patina is one of the most difficult challenges and usually default to describing its color and texture. We dedicated a full chapter to the topic of patina in the guidelines. This is organized around a series of questions that were identified through surveys of the casting community. Here are some of the questions that form the main chapter headings. And there are hyperlinks from this chapter to relevant sections in Volume 2 on the methods of examination and analysis.
Another example of a process step in search of a preferred term is the wax that is created to stand in for the original model in the indirect lost wax process. And I show you here a diagram from the guidelines of that indirect process in which the original model, which is in orange, is molded with a reusable mold that is used to create a wax replica, which is represented in green, and that in turn is embedded in the refractory mold material. The wax is burnt out, and the hollow that's left by the wax is filled with metal, just to remind people of that. And this is the process that is most commonly used to produce editions of bronzes in Western art over the past centuries, and therefore of interest to many of you. This is the wax that is lost. So this wax object or burnt out. And this next diagram illustrates the role that the wax intermodels, as we decided to call them, here too depicted in green, play in the production of several replicas. It also shows how it manifests in further generation of replications, which we define as surmoulage. And I should add that sand casting is a totally different story because there is only one solid pattern, as it's called, or very solid, hard model that's used again and again to form the hollow impression in the sand mold through pressure. Now, I won't regale you with the lengthy exchange around the terms used to describe this wax, but we'll share a few salient points. Here too, diverse terms were used in different contexts. For instance, in foundries throughout the English-speaking world, it is referred to simply as the wax. While an American archaeologist working on ancient Mediterranean bronzes uses the phrase, the wax working model. The wax working model. We opted for intermodel as the preferred term, and this was coined in the 1980s by an object conservator, colleague of ours, and mentor of sorts to many, in the context of early technical studies of Renaissance bronzes. It clearly denotes to us the intermediary role that the wax plays in the process and avoids potential confusion that we felt just simple wax might have. In France, it turns out, given that we were dealing a lot with also the French definitions and translations, that the use of the term model automatically implies a direct work of the creator sculptor in legal parlance. And since such waxes are usually considered ephemeral intermediary steps or tools towards the creation of the desired bronze that don't necessarily involve the hand of the artist, the use of model is avoided. The French terms for intermodel are traditionally épreuve en cire, which is translated as proof or test in wax, or tirage du moule, which literally means that which is pulled from the mold. And in instances where that épreuve is heavily reworked before casting, it does in fact qualify as a modèle intermédiaire. To complicate matters, in the 19th century, such épreuves were called surmoulées, which, as you noted in our diagram, sort of corresponds to the term that we in English use to describe lots of sort of subsequent generations that are sort of taken from molds taken after any existing bronze. And that term may lead us down a rabbit hole that we don't have time to go down here together. So the question is of how to correctly describe a bronze that is produced in multiple versions, such as copies, variants, and replicas, and other terms, is a topic of ongoing confusion, which I'm sure many of you have dealt with and debate, and that we have attempted to address in the guidelines. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. We recognize that there is still much to do with regard to terminology. Language is constantly evolving, and we invite you to contribute to the discussion and look forward to learning more about how you all have been dealing with issues of descriptive terminology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fran and Jane and David as well. I mean, that opens up so many important questions, and it has implications for those of us who work in other periods and are faced with how to construct order and write a catalogue raisonné. In my case, it's a catalogue of the work of Louis-François Roubiliac. We say Roubiliac in England, so I'm sticking with that. And his oeuvre consists of busts and monuments. Now, I wrote a detailed catalogue of the monuments as part of a monograph that I wrote with David Byman back in 1995. And I'm now working on a catalogue raisonné of all of Roubiliac's work, revisiting the monuments, but at the moment, particularly concentrating on the busts. As I see it, this catalogue is conceived more as a tool for investigating historical sculptural practices and less as a body of data for assessing objects on the market. I think it probably will be used in that way. I should add that bronzes are a minor part of the oeuvre. But the issues raised already here have implications for how we might think about the catalogue raisonné of other sculptors working in different materials and using other techniques. And the concept of the intermodel, I think, is especially relevant here. How do we think about processes and sequences? And how can we articulate this in a catalogue raisonné, not only in the individual entries for specific objects, or indeed lost objects, and how do we articulate it in the very structure of the catalogue raisonné? In the case of Roubiliac sculpture, we have surviving objects, a lot of documentary sources, including a posthumous sale catalogue. Somehow we've got to work with that as well. Unsurprisingly, various processes of replication are central, as was so often the case with sculpture. And that's especially relevant to busts. So here you see two busts of Isaac Newton, one from 1735 and one from 1755, using from what Fran has already said, I hesitate to use this term, using the same model. Casting was also central, and not just for the production of multiples, because casting could be used in the making of models. And these models were not necessarily modeled, but partly cast. So another source of confusion. So here you have two busts, one of John Ray, a 17th century subject, and the contemporary sitter, Jonathan Tyers, where the same drapery pattern is used. Now, the nature of the terracottas is various and ambiguous. Terracotta can be used as a model, but then can be displayed as an autonomous work in its own right. How do we distinguish these, and how do we describe such distinctions? And there is a lot of uncertainty about processes. So here are various versions of Roubiliac's bust of Pope, all done in his lifetime and in different materials. If we set aside the bronzes, there are multiple versions in marble, plaster, and terracotta. And what was the sequence and what was the relationship? And these were produced over an extended period from 1738 to 1760. I'm showing you the marbles lined up together, but also one of the earliest ones made for a friend of Pope's. Now, the terracotta versions, or the terracotta version that you see here, is not necessarily the first. So it's not necessarily our model. It could well have been produced when Roubiliac moved to producing a full-scale bust rather than just the head. In addition to that, we also have plasters by other sculptors, and here are two of them, which are cast from, in some cases, a marble, some cases a terracotta, probably. There's an ambiguity of terms here. Model, which I now use with great trepidation, as a result of what Fran said earlier, mold and cast, and the whole idea of what we mean by a multiple, not to mention the terms that we use for, say, a base and socle and so on. There's an ambiguity in how we use these terms now, but also how we use terms found in contemporary documents. How can a catalogue raisonné be structured to deal with the uncertainty about sequences and relationships between surviving objects and between surviving objects and what are lost works merely hinted at in documentary sources? Relationships are key here. How can such a catalogue be structured without assuming a predetermined notion of process? How can the evidence be structured in a way that allows other alternative interpretations, other alternative narratives? It's good to be tentative and non-definitive here, and to allow a sort of flexibility for whoever's going to make use of all this stuff later. So the sequences and relationship between the different versions should be left open. And I'm thinking here of as an exemplar, the wonderful catalogue that Jennifer Montague wrote as part of her great Algardi monograph, which very much keeps open the uncertainty of the place of some of these objects. Also, we need to think about the afterlife of these works. And here we have to engage with surfaces. And I must confess, I find it very difficult to know what, if at all, what surfaces are actually 18th century surfaces and what has happened to them. So these are things that I think connect with what we've already heard about in the case of bronzes. And there's a lot of shared territory here. So that's the end of my contribution. And I'm now going to hand over to Marin.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I'm going to shift things maybe a little bit into the 20th century. So a slightly different perspective in talking about modern sculpture. So every catalogue raisonné presents a unique set of challenges and specificities related to cataloging and organization. For this session, however, I thought I might discuss the complexity of terminology and labeling associated with sculpture through the case study of a single modern artist, the Italian-American designer, printmaker, and sculptor Harry Bertoia, born in 1915, died in 1978. An innovative artist, Bertoia was a celebrated and active sculptor during his lifetime, though he is perhaps not as well known today, beyond maybe his iconic furniture designs for the Knoll Corporation and his pioneering sound sculptures. Recent and forthcoming books, a major retrospective exhibition opening at the National Sculpture Center in Dallas of January 22, and of course the Harry Bertoia Catalogue Raisonné project all hope to change this. And in full disclosure, the covers of the three forthcoming books that I'm showing you and one that has previously been published, I have been very personally invested in this artist for the better part of a decade now, and I am involved in a number of those projects. By way of brief introduction, particularly in regards to the topic under discussion today, and for those not familiar with Bertoia and his work, he was a tremendously prolific artist. Estimates range from around 10,000 to perhaps upwards of 20,000 distinct works in a range of media, including metalwork and monotypes, sculptures, and sounding sculptures, realized in a diversity of materials and techniques. The realities of Bertoia's diverse and prolific career presents particular challenges to researchers, curators, and collectors, particularly in how to identify or label works individually and how to categorize them collectively. In January 2019, the Harry Bertoia Foundation, established by the artist's youngest child, Celia Bertoia, launched a comprehensive Catalogue Raisonné project. A multi-year undertaking, the Catalogue Raisonné will result in a digital publication released in stages and continually updated. And I think that none of us associated with the project have any illusion that this will ever be completed, right? It's going to be a very living document and publication. Beyond the arduous goal of researching and documenting as many Bertoia works as possible, a crucial component of the project has been to better define and unify the language specific to Bertoia's artistic output. Bertoia created thousands of distinct designs, graphics, and sculptures over the course of his nearly 40-year career. With only a few exceptions, none of these pieces were signed, dated, or titled by the artist. He also used a myriad of materials and techniques, many of which were quite unique to his artistic practice. While there are distinctive styles or approaches associated with various periods of his career, Bertoia did not work in strict series or editions, often returning to or building upon earlier experiments and realized pieces. He also frequently switched between mediums, often in a single day, working, for example, on a sculpture in his Ballet, Pennsylvania studio during the day and returning and creating monotypes in his Bartow studio late into the evening. In regard to identification, over the 40+ years since Bertoia's death, a number of consistent, if ultimately incorrect, labeling conventions have been applied to his work. First and foremost, almost all work should actually be listed as untitled, though certain descriptive labels have become common as titles. As art historian June Compass Nelson wrote during Bertoia's lifetime, quote, "Aesthetic ideas and intellectual concepts have led him to create abstract forms, which were later identified with such things in nature as bushes, trees, flowers, dandelions, dogwoods, sunbursts, galaxies, reeds, and straw. But it should be noted that the names were applied as a label as a convenient reference," end quote. While willow or spillcast, for example, are helpful descriptors designating a particular form or technique, such terms are neither correct titles nor benign placeholders of specific meaning. One area that has been particularly susceptible to mislabeling has been Bertoia's sounding sculpture, a category comprised of gongs, singing bars, and tonals, sculptures made up of rods in various heights, metals, configurations, sometimes topped with a cylinder or cattail tops. And both of those terms too are also something that have become associated. So the three tonals that I'm showing you here have cattail tops on the far left, the cylinders on the far right, but even within those individual categories, there's a huge range of diversity. So the two cattail tops I'm showing you here, one is made in copper, one is made in monal. So you have various ranges of techniques, materials, and forms existing even within a single category of work. Sonambient, a neologism invented by Bertoia, is often used as a shorthand or synonym for sounding sculpture and frequently appears as a modifier for Bertoia's barn studio, i.e. the sonambient barn. These works the term sonambient also becomes associated with works that were one time placed in the sonambient barn as well. The term, however, sonambient, should really only be used to designate the recordings that Bertoia made in the 1970s when he played these sculptures, which have subsequently been released as LPs, CDs, and digital files. The term can also be used in reference to a film made by Jeffrey and Miriam Eager, or as an overarching artistic concept connoting the use of sculpture to create an ambient sound environment, often associated with performances enacted by Bertoia in his Bartow barn. And I really just wanted to kind of pull out this one term of sonambient, because I think it really does become emblematic of the way that terminology oftentimes grows and exists beyond the scope of an artist's own practice, and becomes something of its own within the market or within scholarship, or in how the work is presented in museums. And I think that's also something that's really crucial to our project, and kind of course correcting and really identifying what these terms mean, which I think is something that resonates with the presentations that have come before. With an artist who was not overly concerned with how his work was titled, labeled, or categorized, for him, it was really just all about the act of making and making in metal. Focusing on the exceptional materials, techniques, and processes used or created by Bertoia has proven the best, most authentic guide to categorizing his work posthumously. And we very much are in the process of kind of organizing and getting a handle on this. Welding, for example, has, actually, I'll just pause briefly on this slide of the organizational chart. And this is something that we've kind of internally been developing and has proven crucial to the project, and using it as a kind of guiding practice. And I think really for us within the project, it has been using the materials and also the techniques in which he utilized those materials. So for example, in his practice, welding became a core central technique, right? We see it across all different categories, all different works that he developed. But even within that welding, so we have welded form as a particular category, but even within that category, there are numerous different ways in which welding becomes central to how we understand that particular work. So spill cast, fuse shot, melt, press, each designate specific ways in which he transformed bronze. He worked extensively with bronze, but in a way maybe that is not as traditional that we associate with sculpture, and certainly very different from the type of bronze sculpture we've previously heard about today. He very much, he never cast bronze. He never worked in editions. Actually, there's only one very small edition that he created towards the end of his life. So again, we're talking about a very, distinct, unique way of creating individual works. And even again, within the process of welding or using bronze, the one thing that we might get close to is the spill casting technique that he developed. But again, this is a process that is much more kind of intuitive and open to chance, where he's pouring molten hot bronze into a bed of sand and then manipulating it with rocks and chemicals and sticks in order for it to harden into the final sculptural form that we see. And I'm just showing you one example here of a freestanding spill cast that he created. Also within his career, Bertoia used wire, right? So wire is another example in which it becomes kind of crucial to his sculptural practice. And we see it manifested in all sorts of different ways, from the gathered wire works, sometimes known as his willows that you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner, to the dandelion forms, right? Which has a kind of centrifugal core in which he's like hand welded thousands of wires that come out into what looks like a dandelion or sunburst final form. He's also constructing open forms, works that we refer to as straws, right? So even if we decided, okay, we're only going to categorize these works through the idea of wire, there's a huge range of diversity within that category. While the ongoing Harry Bertoia Catalogue Raisonné project continues to refine and coalesce the terminology applied to the artist's work, it is being shaped by the guiding principle that Bertoia's creative output shares a singular holistic language. And I think this has become something that, you know, in terms of a guiding principle, we're always kind of balancing this idea of really doing a deep dive into the archival material that we do have left, that comes from Bertoia himself or those very much closely aligned with him during his lifetime, and then trying to balance that with the kind of afterlife that those terminology have taken, right? So there's a kind of familiarity or comfort level that have now become associated, whether it's collectors, auction houses, art historian, there's a kind of shorthand. And so it really is, again, about that course correcting to try to balance between this is actually what the correct term or label is, and this is then becomes a process of kind of re-educating people who are interested in Bertoia's work to know that terminology instead of just kind of relying on this shorthand that really isn't based in anything that the artist himself intended within his practice. While capturing the specific histories of individual pieces is central to the core mission, of equal importance within the Catalogue Raisonné project, however, is establishing a so-called kind of Harry Bertoia lexicon. This is not meant to silo the various areas of his creative practice, but rather to codify and unify the material mediums and techniques upon which he drew and pioneered as a means to better understand his work holistically and appreciate its depth and complexity within the broader sphere of modern sculpture during the mid-20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marin. That was fascinating. And I think together our various presentations and the things we've been all puzzling with, I think it's very interesting for us to come together and explore these things. Could I perhaps start the discussion with this difficult term model, which Francesca has firmly rejected, but from my point of view, I'm not quite sure what to call these terracottas, which seem to be, in some cases but not all, a sort of starting point. And then I'm thinking of with Marin's material. In a sense, it's just so diverse. And what's the relationship between the prints and there's, in a sense, much less obvious structure. So I found myself thinking, what a nightmare to have to grapple with it. Perhaps you don't feel it's a nightmare. Anyhow, that's just to get the discussion going.
I'm not rejecting the term model by any means. I was just trying to, and David, please jump into, since you were very much part of that discussion with Elisabeth about the use of the term model. My understanding was just that that's very specifically a French thing, the implications of the use of that term. I mean, we certainly in English use model for what you were describing all the time. So what I've wrestled with is that sequence of, let's take those François Ier de Primaticio casts of Laocoon or some of the Belvedere sculptures. And there's so many layers of molding and modeling. And how do you refer to the one that's immediately before it and then the one before it? And I, at one point, had suggested the use of the precursor model, but then that was confusing too. So that was shot down. But yes, it's a challenge. So, but I don't know, maybe Marin, you have some thoughts, although it's a slightly different situation in your case, since most of them seem to be very unique. So
yeah, I do think though, like in terms of thinking about modeling, or maybe if we even extrapolate it further into the idea of process, I mean, I think one of the things that maybe all of us became attracted to with sculpture in the first place is that it is so multi-stage, and that there are these other components that operate within the sphere, even when you're dealing with just a singular sculptural object. And certainly, you know, with an artist like Bertoia, who certainly, you know, he's his own thing. It's not like the model we're coming up with him is in any way going to be adaptable to anyone else. But even if we take this idea of the model, it is really hard to track with him, because certainly for some of his larger scale commissions, he's doing a lot of projects in the immediate post-war period for architectural structures. And in those cases, he is doing kind of what we might think of as models or maquettes, though his process is really pretty organic in the way that none of those early models or maquettes really ever match up with where he actually ends up looking at. And Malcolm, your evocation of the monotypes, which again is a really interesting kind of facet of his practice, in that he's using printing, which is, you know, inherently a kind of multiple reproductive medium, and yet he's still creating one-offs in those monotypes. So he's particularly focused in on the monotypes that are only going to be its own thing. But in those cases, we have hundreds, if not thousands, of monotypes that directly relate to his sculptural practice. And I think one of the things that's been a big struggle for everybody on our team has been a struggle, but also something that's really exciting, is to see how much of that overlap is existing between the languages of sculpture and printmaking. And we've been very kind of cautious to not directly equate like, oh, this is a sketch, because he is using it as a kind of sketch, right? He's working through his ideas in those monotypes, because there's an immediacy to that. But we are always really kind of hesitant to be like, oh, this is a sketch for this sculpture, because you just can't determine it. And because he's returning to these works all the time, it's like, was this a sketch, or was this a monotype he created afterwards to like even further the sculptural form? So that's in no way like a cohesive answer to anything, but just I really love that complexity, and seeing how difficult and gnarly it is to kind of work through those different stages of processes, and then the language that we have to use and adapt and create in order to fully kind of encapsulate those processes.
And will the monotypes be included in the catalogue?
Yeah, it was very important for us to do it. You know, I think I understand why certain catalog raisonnés do only a certain facet of an artist's career. But for us, there was really never a question that it was going to be comprehensive. So we are including everything from, you know, the design, the furniture and the tea sets and the jewelry, the monotypes, the sculpture, everything, because I think you really do need to see that overlap. And I think in that classification system that I showed during my presentation, what's been really great about the database we're using is that we can link through keywords. So you can actually, if you want to think about his straws, you can link across the monotypes, the sculptures. You can see it within various practice aspects of his practice. And that for an artist like Bertoia has proven really crucial and absolutely revelatory to his practice.
So doing it digitally, you're freed from being constricted to a linear sequence, which assumes a certain fixed process. So it's a more dynamic thing. Yes. Yeah,
and it very much feels like that kind of living language where you need to see those connective threads. It's been crucial, I think, for an artist who doesn't fit neatly into categories, having that kind of the platform and the abilities that a digital platform allows you to do has been absolutely crucial.
Yes, and say in the 18th century, what I'm doing, some of those busts of Pope, there's one of them which was actually a plaster which he was bought by the British Museum from his posthumous sale. So he was producing replicas. He actually was producing multiples all the way through. And so there's a lot of sort of ambiguity in how does one, and I was thinking with the bronzes and Bologna and his various associates and followers, the how you position these and say, I mean, conventionally, one remembers people saying, oh, well, this was finished by Susini, but it's just that seems just oversimplified. And it's, I said, when I take the project that Francesca and Jane and David have been pursuing so interestingly, is that it breaks away from these fixed points of assumptions about process, and is so enriching, but also at the same time, as we all feel, I think, so confusing. How do we deal with it?
Yeah, I thought actually your evocation of like patina and how like that alone is a word that's so crucial to sculpture and sculptural practice, and yet that there's this diversity that creates maybe a consensus, but not. But I'm so looking forward just to like having that discussion be accessible and a resource for dealing with it, even for an artist in the 20th century like Bertoia. I mean, the works that I showed, there's all sorts of different patinas that chemical patinas that he's utilizing and that have changed afterwards. So I think that is a resource, but I wonder if maybe Francesca and Jane, you could talk a little bit more about patina or how those conversations of consensus came together.
Well, it was amazingly argumentative, actually, because certain specialists felt a weakening of their definition of the term to include others. And I will say that Fran and I have we lean towards our backgrounds more to the history of technology and to art history, curatorial practice. And we felt really strongly to include all parts as was stated. And in the end, I'm actually not sure that would have, had there been another person in charge of the publication, it may have ended differently, to be honest. But one of the parts that I look at my own work and many of my colleagues that have written for years on bronzes, both in conservation and curatorially, and I think in art history, and we really have avoided talking about the patina because it is difficult to know what you're looking at. And of course, there's the issue that a patina can always be redone over time also. And I'm particularly excited about that part of volume 2 that sets out a path to either just with your eyes or with some magnification, more magnification, the ability to carry out some analytical work, working with a team to actually, for all of us to start doing a better job. And that's relying, of course, on research that's been done over the last, say, 10 years, and just bringing that all together and making it as practical and accessible in one spot as possible. And that part of it is an exciting aspect of a new way to look at the surface.
But it also, I think, brings into play issues of response and reception, but how bronzes are looked at, not just bronzes, but how sculptures are looked at in a later period. And I think that bringing that into the catalogue, Raisonné, not only thinking about the originating moment, as it were, when things were made and placing them, and trying to be precise about that, but actually being alive to the afterlife of these objects. And that's partly thinking of the surfaces and how it gets one into modes of viewing, really. So it can connect with aspects of art history that often are not really, don't make their way into a catalogue Raisonné. Okay, there may be provenance, but that's, usually organized so as to back up some sort of argument about this particular work being an original or whatever, but particularly with patination. I remember Tony Radcliffe once saying that the patination on a bronze doesn't tell you where a bronze was made; it tells you where it's been.
Yes.
I think nicely to hang on to. Francesca, no doubt, can remember him saying this. So.
No, I don't remember that, but I do know that there's, a history of taste for what something should look like, and that I think Fitzwilliam, for instance, a lot of the antique archaeological bronzes were treated and all have a very similar patina, a coating of some kind. So yes, that whole question of the full life of the object, and teasing out evidence of that as well, and then being able to again discern that from the original appearance or shape of the thing is something that we get into a little bit, and we do, especially in the general introduction, just try to bring up, I mean, one of the slides that I showed was drawn from that, just the list of different, kinds of moments or kinds of interventions that may have altered the sculpture.
Well, what this discussion and the contributions have brought out for me is the complexity of addressing sculpture, but the importance of grappling with these terms, even though they may be confusing and difficult, because I think just what we've done today has actually brought out some very key issues for those of us who are concerned with the history of sculpture.